Welcome. This video will guide you through the process of replacing O-rings in a Viking universal seal pump with an O-Pro barrier seal. Consult the appropriate technical service manuals before you begin for safety information. Tools required include a set of SAE Allen wrenches, a small screwdriver or cold chisel, a soft-headed hammer, a brass or a hardwood bar, hook nose spanner wrench, box end wrenches, an O-ring pick, as well as O-ring lubricant or grease, and a grease gun. The lubricant and grease should be food grade if the pump is to be used on food products like chocolate. The O-ring replacement kit includes the two outer static O-rings, the inner dynamic O-rings, a seal installation sleeve, two jack bolts for removing the O-Pro barrier seal, and a head gasket in case the head and rotor shaft must be removed. First, bend up the tang on the lock washer. Insert the brass bar into the top port to prevent rotation of the rotor and shaft. Use the hook nose spanner to remove the lock nut and lock washer. Remove the brass bar. Loosen the two Allen head set screws on the face of the bearing housing. Remove the bearing housing. Use a 2-pin spanner wrench if needed. Remove the bearing spacer collar. Remove the half-round rings, except on these sizes, which do not use them. Remove the grease fitting and pipe plug from the O-Pro barrier seal gland. Loosen the gland nuts, securing the O-Pro barrier seal in the bracket, and remove the T-bolts. Thread the jack bolts into the tapped holes at the top and bottom of the barrier seal, and use a wrench to help press the barrier seal out of the bracket, alternating back and forth between jack bolts. Remove the O-Pro barrier seal. Clean as much old grease and product out of the area between the bracket bore and shaft as possible, taking care not to nick the surfaces. Remove the inner dynamic O-rings and outer static O-rings. The remainder of this video illustrates the process of replacing O-rings by first removing the head and rotor shaft, which allows inspection for wear on internal parts and the shaft. But it's also possible to simply reinstall the barrier seal and new O-rings with the rotor shaft in place. This may even be done with the pump installed on its base and connected to piping, provided that spacer couplings were used to allow back pull-out and removal of the O-Pro barrier seal, pressure is relieved before removal, and liquid is drained. Remove the head by unscrewing the head cap screws and carefully tilting the head back to ensure the idler gear does not slip off the pin and fall. Discard the old head gasket. Remove the rotor shaft and examine the shaft for wear. Excessive wear at the O-ring locations may require replacement of the rotor shaft to ensure a good seal. Lubricate the O-rings and O-Pro barrier seal thoroughly with O-ring lubricant or grease. Install the inner dynamic O-rings and the outer static O-rings in the grooves. Then install the O-Pro barrier seal into the bracket, with the flat surfaces of the gland facing upward. This positions the lubrication groove at the opposite end in the 6 o'clock position. You will encounter resistance as the first outer O-ring enters the bushing bore area. Rotate the O-Pro barrier seal as needed, but don't hammer it or you may damage the O-ring. Once in far enough, you may be able to use the gland bolts to gently pull the barrier seal completely into the bracket bore. Tighten both nuts on the gland bolts completely. Slide the seal installation sleeve, if provided, over the shaft. The LS size pump does not use one. Then insert the rotor shaft, being careful not to allow the keyway or threads on the shaft to contact an O-ring. This may be taped over to ensure that O-rings aren't cut by sharp edges. Remove the steel installation sleeve. Use gasket sealant and a new gasket to reinstall the head and idler gear. Ensure that the crescent is opposite the sealing area between the ports. If the pump has a relief valve on the head, it should point toward the suction port. Now replace the half-round rings and bearing spacer collar. Replace the bearing housing. Tighten the lock nut and bend a tang from the lock washer into a slot to lock the bearing to the shaft. Now set the end clearance. Your Viking distributor can provide the correct settings. A separate video, Setting End Clearance, which provides more detail on this procedure, is available on the Viking pump website. After setting the end clearance, tighten the bearing housing set screws and test rotation. Using a thread sealant, install the grease fitting into one of the holes in the O-Pro barrier seal gland. Either hole in the gland can be used for the grease fitting, which allows re-greasing from either side of the pump. Install a pipe plug into the other hole of the gland using thread sealant. Tighten the grease fitting and pipe plug with a wrench. Remove the grease relief fitting from the bracket. Now grease the gland until grease comes out of the adapter fitting. After cleaning excess grease off the adapter, use thread sealant to insert the grease relief fitting into the adapter and tighten. Re-grease the gland until sufficient grease comes out of the grease relief fitting to ensure that all air has been purged. Rotating the shaft while greasing will help remove trapped air. Regular re-greasing is required, and discoloration of grease coming out of the relief fitting is an indication that O-rings may need to be replaced. Your pump is now ready to be reinstalled. Thank you for watching.